Egypt is a security partner of the Israelis, has been for 30 years. And they used to control the Gaza Strip between 1949 and 1973, and they hated it. So there's no love lost between the Palestinians and the Egyptians. And while the Egyptians will not say this publicly, they are thrilled with what is about to happen. Jordan is a satellite state of Israel that is basically paid for with international aid, primarily from the United States. So that's not a security threat either. Syria is in a civil war. They don't have the capacity to control their own territory, much less do something at the Golan. That just leaves Lebanon, which is a failed state. And while Hezbollah has some teeth, what they don't have is an army. So they might be able to launch some rockets over, and that might cause some heartburn in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. It's not a traditional invasion. From the Israeli point of view, all of the local states are known quantities. The only questions that matter then are Iran and Saudi Arabia. In the case of the Iranians, they have some missiles that could reach Iran, but nothing that can change the balance of forces on the ground. They certainly can't deploy an army because they'd have to go through Iraq and Syria just to get there in the first place. That's well beyond their capabilities. And then there's Saudi Arabia. Now, the Saudis have been pushing for a direct alliance with the Israelis. They've been quiet security partners for the last 20 years. Basically, whenever the United States has said something less than complimentary about the Saudis or the Israelis, the two of them get closer together. And Israel has become a transit point for American weapons technology and training into Saudi Arabia now for quite some time. And they were trying to formalize that relationship. The question now is whether that's still going to move forward. And that is subject to an internal debate within Riyadh that's intergenerational. The king's generation, the older folks, like the idea of the Palestinian cause and thought that any deal that was going to proceed had to include something for the Palestinians as well. The younger generation, that includes the crown prince, thinks the opposite, thinks that the Palestinians are wastes of skin and just need to be disappeared into history so they can get on with the real work of Saudi power. And so they are now having a debate internally about how seriously to take this. And when they're done with that debate, which will probably be within a month, we're going to have a very firm idea of what Saudi plans are for the next 20 years. The Middle East is run by a series of autocrats. So you've got your political elite, in the case of the Saudis, the royal family, who control all the levers of power. And then you have the street that has to be managed. And obviously the street is boiling right now. But this isn't the first time this has happened. And it is very, very, very rare that the street can actually overthrow the elite because the elite controls all the security services, all the guns, and generally they have no problem shooting their own people. Also remember that the street in Saudi Arabia is fat. The national security strategy of most of the Gulf states is to give their people heart disease so they can't protest. And the Saudis have been very, very successful at that. Either the Israelis are going to directly occupy it in perpetuity, in which case they will be fighting a series of guerrilla wars against the local population forever, or they clear out Hamas and then go home, rebuild the wall, and Hamas Mark II takes control. Either way, you're looking at a humanitarian disaster for this region for the foreseeable future. One of the fun things about Joe Biden is because he's older than the pyramids, he's seen the long stretch of history, and he has come to a lot of conclusions about who the powers are worth sticking with over the long term once you just kind of wave the bullshit away. And in his view, Israel, for all of its warts, and there are many, is still the only Western-oriented country, is still the only country with the concept of human rights, is still the only country with a modern economy that can look after itself for the most part, is still the only democracy. And while it is flawed by all of those measures, it is better than Egypt or Lebanon or Syria or Jordan. And so if you have to choose, you might as well choose publicly and boldly. And that's exactly what he's done. Will that generate complications down the line? Yeah, it's going to generate complications tomorrow. But making it very clear where the United States stands and the pecking order of this and other regions, you got to admit it's kind of refreshing compared to the presidents we've had for the last 25 years. The United States has been trying to get out of the Middle East for the last 20 years. We finally pulled it off under Biden. It was a mess with the Afghanistan withdrawal, but it freed up American strategic bandwidth for other things. Biden's now making it very clear that he doesn't really care what happens to the Palestinians because Israel is the friend, Israel is the family, Israel is the ally. That means that we are going to be in a situation where the street, and to a lesser degree, the elites of this entire region, know exactly where they stand in American eyes. And that is going to force them to take certain policy changes that we're going to perceive as anti American. I mean, let's be honest. Most of the Arab world aren't friendly, and they're certainly not what I would consider pro American. But it's the United States establishing itself as a power broker without being a manager. The Middle East has not had this sort of strategic power vacuum for a very long time. It's going to lead to a lot of these smaller powers taking matters into their own hands. That's going to generate a lot more hot conflict. In the case of Israel, that's just an issue for the Palestinians. But for the case of the Saudis, that means all of a sudden they have to seriously consider arming themselves. For the Egyptians, it means that they're kind of on their own. And they're going to also have to make public stances vis-a-vis Israel and show exactly where they stand. It's a bracing moment. This region has always been a mess. Biden's basically calling it a mess and picking sides. From a train wreck fascination point of view, this is going to get really interesting. No, I haven't seen anything so far that really hurts the United States at this point. In the aftermath of the war on terror, we've got a million-man military that has now had 3 years to rest, recruit, and rearm, absorb the lessons, and get ready for what's next. We're not going to be putting boots on the ground in the Israeli area, certainly not in Palestine. So there's no real issue there. Also, because the United States is not involved in any sort of meaningful conflict at the time, we easily have the capacity of intervening indirectly with military support, special forces, finance, intelligence in a dozen areas at once. So I'm not really concerned at all about limitations on American power at the moment. Now, the idea that China would benefit from crises elsewhere in the world is not one to reject out of hand, because the idea is if the US is obsessed with this, that, and the other thing, that maybe we'll miss things like Taiwan. But until you actually have boots on the ground, that is not the case. So during the war on terror, it would have been impossible for the United States to engage another part of the world with 100,000 troops because all of our deployable forces were already in play. That's not the case today. So they would have to bait us into multiple hot conflicts where we were actually involved with the shooting. We're nowhere close to that. That's not going to be Ukraine as long as Ukraine is alive. Aside from providing intelligence and equipment, the Biden administration has not moved us closer to being in any sort of meaningful conflict with anyone. This is probably what we're seeing under Trump and under Biden, the building of the new template, where the U.S. regularly puts its finger on the scales but doesn't actually put boots on the ground. So the risk is to be borne by foreign partners. The fighting is to be done by foreign partners. So we're not going to have troops in Ukraine. We're not going to have troops in Gaza, but we are perfectly willing to step in with military assistance and intelligence in order to help certain players that we want to do better. That is probably what we're going to be doing for the next 20 years, regardless of who wins the next presidency. As for decision making within the United States, Congress is kind of a mess right now, and that's going to last for a while. We're going through our once every generation or two political reshufflings when the factions that make up the parties move around. And at times like that, you get these little cliques, like the Jim Jordan clique or the Matt Gaetz clique, who rise to prominence because the party is no longer capable of policing its own. We're seeing the same thing on the Democratic side. It's just because they're in the minority, it's not as loud. That will last until such time as the factions settle into a new format. And I think that's still going to take at least another 3 or 4 years. I don't think it's going to happen before this presidential cycle is finished. If you look at this as objectively as you can, the very short version is that the Trump administration, by elevating the populists, pushed the business community and the national security community out of the Republican coalition. So they've effectively become swing voters. And with all this churn now, Congress is going to have a very difficult time doing anything until such time as the party structure settles into a format that is more appropriate for the environment that we're in. If I were a betting man, I would guess that this is the moment that a third party of disaffected Republicans forms and then sucks in a lot of moderate Democrats to become the balance of power within Congress. We're not there yet. A lot of these disaffected Republicans haven't quite come to the conclusion that they are no longer functionally party members, but I think we're going to get there in the next 2 years. But this is the 7th time we've gone through one of these transitions. And in the first 3, we definitely got a third party that formed, and then one of those 3 parties died. In the more recent three, what's happened is there was an evolution within the coalitions and the factions switched side. What we're going through right now is a lot more similar to the first three, because right now the core, the decision makers, the old school Republicans have been ejected from their own institution. And these are people who have the money, who have the skill set, who know how to work together, and above all, have never not been part of a political coalition. So they're kind of having this allergic response to being out of power completely. That's going to trigger them to do something that, from our point of view today, might be a little unprecedented. But if you look back historically, we've done this 3 times before. If the Saudis decide to ignore the Palestinians and just cut the deal with the Israelis, they're perfectly capable of managing their own street. And then you have this bilateral alliance within the region that takes the most technological power and merges it with the largest regional economy and the world's largest oil producer. That's a powerful partnership. And if the Saudis do manage to move on from the Palestinians, and the Emiratis already have, the Moroccans already have, the Egyptians already have, and that would probably trigger the Omanis and the Kuwaitis and all the others to join as well. So if this sticks, you're talking about the Israelis and the Arab world more or less strategically being on the same side. And at that point, it doesn't really matter what the Americans do. In fact, that would allow the Americans just to step back and allow the region to take care of Iran. From our point of view, that might be the least bad outcome. Palestine, and to a lesser degree, Israel, not an oil producer or an oil consumer or an oil transit point. Back in 1973 with the Yom Kippur War, that is where the Saudis, under the older generation, took a strong stance for the Palestinians and against the West when it came to energy policy. That created OPEC, that created all the pain that is still kind of lingering in the back of our lizard brain. But that hasn't been relevant for 30 years. So what we saw during the late 1990s and the very early 2000s is every time something would cook off in the Palestinian territories, oil prices would go up just out of emotion. But once we had the 9/11 assault and the Iraq War and the coup in Venezuela, or the coup attempt in Venezuela, the oil markets kind of wisened up and like, okay, there are a lot bigger things going on here that have a very real impact on this market than stone throwers in the West Bank. And so over the next 20 years, the Palestinians just vanished from the scene as a factor in energy. And what we're seeing today is an underlining that that is still the case. So if there is going to be an oil shock, it will not have anything to do with Palestine or Israel. It will be about the Saudi response to what's going on in Palestine and Israel. And at the moment, we're still waiting for that intergenerational argument to be shaken out. If the king wins, well, it was the king's generation that played a role in the formation of OPEC. And it will not be quiet if it goes that direction. The older generation, this is going to be more complicated because if there's one thing that everyone in Saudi Arabia recognizes is that they're fat and they're lazy and they're incapable of defending themselves. They have to have a security guarantor. And if they side against Israel in this fight publicly and loudly, well, that'll never be the United States or Israel then. And all of a sudden, then they've got to find someone else, anyone else. And all of the other options are messy. The Saudis know that the Chinese don't have the military capacity to project past Taiwan, much less all the way to the Persian Gulf. But they also recognize that the Chinese are the world's largest oil importer, and the Chinese recognize that the Saudis are the world's largest oil exporter. So the idea that the two of them wouldn't have some sort of corporate economic relationship is equally silly. But there's only so far that you can take that. The Chinese were very clear at the BRICS summit that they had no interest in a post-dollar world. It's just that wasn't picked up by U.S. finance because it doesn't match the de-dollarization drama mantra that we're all talking about here. I mean, it's really not a discussion in Beijing or in Johannesburg or in New Delhi. The only country that feels that they have a strategic interest in a non-dollar world are the Russians, and they just want everyone to use the ruble, which is, of course, stupid. The yuan is not internationally exchanged. The rupee is a very soft currency. The Russian system is under sanctions, and the Brazilians have no idea what they're doing. There is no alternative here at all. The closest would have been the euro, but 10 years ago, when they were having their financial crisis, they started confiscating insured banks' deposits to pay for their bailouts, which eliminated any possibility of ever being the euro. And in the aftermath of the sanctions on Russia, the euro and the yen are de facto subsidiaries of the US dollar now. I mean, there's not even anyone who's pretending that they might be next. There is no economic outcome from the Gaza operation. It's a non-factor economically. And from a strategic point of view for the United States, it's also a non-factor. The only way it matters is through second, third, and fourth degree steps that none of which are guaranteed to happen, none of which are likely to happen. But Ukraine, whew, couple orders of magnitude more important. This is the ninth war that the Russians have launched since 1991 and in an attempt to reshape their neighborhood. And if they succeed in Ukraine, Ukraine doesn't solve their strategic problems. They're trying to build a better external crustal defense. Romania, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Poland solve that problem. So if Ukraine falls, we will have a different war, and one where the United States will have boots on the ground and nukes will fly. Blocking the Russians from advancing past Ukraine is a core national interest to the United States. In addition, the economics of this speak for themselves. You've got the world's number one wheat exporter and number five wheat exporter locked in a war. It involves the world's largest and third largest sources of potash fertilizer. It involves the world's second largest sources of oil and natural gas. The economics of this are immense. I can think of no better way of showing you that everyone who was Republican who could do math has been ejected from the party than talking about how Republicans are now against assisting a country that is a democracy have failed, an economic conduit that's critical in order to hold back a irredentist power that holds huge control over wide swaths of the global economic system. I mean, it's like this should be the type of conflicts that traditional Republicans are all about because it stops so many things. But instead, we've got this wing of the party that has managed to take over and clearly can't find Canada on a map or do basic math. We will find a way to make it work because the alternative is to risk losing American cities. We found out in the Battle of Kiev that the Russians were incompetent at modern warfare. They're not any good at logistics. Their training was atrocious. And the fact that you've got Ukraine, which functionally didn't have a military on the first day of this war, that it still exists, is a testament not necessarily to Ukrainian pluck and creativity, but Russian absolute and utter incompetence. And so if we see the Russians prevail in Ukraine, when they reach the NATO border, a fight between the NATO forces, who are the best in the world, and the Russians, who are definitely in the bottom half, would be a bloodbath, and the Russians would be obliterated. But that doesn't change any of their strategic needs. And so nukes would come into play. And the Biden administration, because it's led by a guy who predates the splitting of the atom, knows this in his gut, and we will find a way to make it work. The Russian demographic is one of the worst in the world. This is their last generation where they can try to use conventional military force to reshape it. They know that this is their last shot. They know that this is their last decade as a coherent conventional military power, despite all their flaws. And so they're going to push until they get to a border system that they can hold with a degrading internal system. That goes all the way to Warsaw. But on the military question, there's a reason that the Biden administration has fast-tracked absolutely everything involving missile defense. By the books, by the numbers, we certainly don't have enough missile defense to protect against a broad-spectrum Russian strike. However, every weapon system, every economic system that the Russians have used in the last 2 years has failed pretty dramatically. To think that all of the nukes are the one thing that works to spec, I think takes a little bit of analytical creativity. The concern that this administration is going to have to deal with is what happens if we get to that point and Putin hits the big candy red button and nothing happens. What do you do with someone who attempts to kill 500 million people but fails? Basically, what the Biden administration is dealing with is the four previous administrations abdicated pretty much all global involvement. While I can argue that the United States, because of its insulation and its economic structure and its demographic patterns, is actually in a really good spot for not just today, but for the long term, that does mean that there are a lot of things that have gone down that we've lost the ability to influence easily. This is one of them.